start the recording of this portion. All right, perfect. So what I would ideally want to do if we were meeting face to face is have you all tell me what it is you've discovered in the course of your shared discussion. That doesn't work as well on Zoom. So what I'll try to do is I'll sort of walk my way through some of the things that I noticed in the course of filling these out. And then ask you all to add anything that you saw that you thought was particularly interesting, maybe that I didn't address. Feel free to just copy down pretty much just straightforwardly what I'm going to write up or what I've written up. My goal is for you all to get perfect scores on these assignments. So don't, take advantage of the fact that I'm writing up I wrote up my version of this too. Use that, get full points on it. And remember, the exam is going to be the big thing that's used to determine your grade mainly. So the first of the questions, make sure I'm finding it. There we go. Yeah. All right. So the first of the questions, you were asked to look at the two different inquiries. Like the first one that maybe shouldn't be called an inquiry because of how badly it goes. The two different conversations, anyway, surrounding this sort of issue of vegetarianism. So what's the sort of central issue? It's probably the morality of eating meat, something like that. All right, and the first case went really, really badly. Hopefully that was pretty straightforward. The second case, while seeming maybe, not how people normally talk, went at least better. It was at least a more fruitful conversation. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the differences that maybe existed between those two conversations, the one to go well, the other to go poorly. And the first thing, at least, that I noticed is that Nancy, who's the one who basically starts both conversations, she does a much better job framing the second instance of the discussion than she does the first one, right? In the first case, she just says, oh, meat, that's yucky. Meat is yucky, right? Whereas in the second case, she frames the issue around this question of morality, which is indeed the central issue, right? She makes the claim that it seems to her as if the consumption of meat is immoral. Okay, so what's the problem with the first way of framing it? Well, things being yucky isn't really something you can investigate. If I think, steak tastes gross and you love steak, okay, great. I mean, there's not really anything we can say or do about those various kinds of preferences. Whereas questions about morality, I mean, certainly people can fight about morality. Morality can indeed be a highly contentious topic, but it's at least the kind of topic we can investigate. We can give reasons. If I asked you to say why you thought meat tasted good or didn't taste good, I don't know what you'd say. Similarly, if someone asked me, why do I not like the taste of steak? I don't know what I'm gonna tell you other than that I don't. Right? There's nowhere to go. And since Nancy's the one who starts this conversation, in the first case, she starts it on a bad way. And the conversation frequently sort of degrades as a result of that starting point. So next difference that I really noticed was a difference in tone between the two conversations. In that first case, maybe because of how badly Nancy raised the initial issue, everyone is sort of just loudly and aggressively, insultingly, just asserting that what they believe is correct and that those who disagree are stupid or evil or dumb or whatever. Right? Wackos, I think at one point someone says. And that really sharply contrasted with the way in which the second conversation was sort of structured. People were indeed still presenting what they thought was true. People were still giving their views. There still was disagreement, but the tone was more questioning things. It was more about sort of like asking why people believe the things that they did rather than just asserting, I believe things. One place you really saw this, at one point, someone said something like, I don't think animals are that badly treated. I need to see some evidence to get me to change my mind on that topic. And that's exactly a more helpful way of putting it, right? Now we're talking about the evidence rather than, someone's belief. And evidence, again, is something we can talk about. It's something we can debate. It's something we can investigate. Another thing I noticed, insulting people is always bad. Don't insult people if your goal is to actually have a real inquiry. And the first conversation was filled with insults. The second one avoided it. Right? So it might be obvious or seemingly really obvious, but it's sort of worth noting actually how many of the conversations we are actually exposed to in our lives devolve into insulting. And insults just literally are never going to help an inquiry be carried out successfully. All you can ever do with an insult, maybe, is just make someone shut up. right? If I insult you loudly and vigorously enough, maybe you'll just stop talking. But the goal of an inquiry isn't to get people to stop talking. The goal of the inquiry is to figure out what's true. And having everyone talk, everyone contributing, is only going to make the inquiry more successful. So nothing good ever comes from insulting in the course of an inquiry. The first one features insults, the second one doesn't. Last big one, these second two are really closely related, but so we'll maybe talk about them together. Is that the second instance of a conversation features what we're going to call an argument. Now, an argument, this word in normal life just means when people fight about stuff. We're going to use in logic argument in a very technical sense. An argument is anytime you give reasons to believe that something is true. So when Nancy says, I believe that it's immoral to eat meat because, that because is being the key word, because I don't think human beings have the right to kill animals. That's an argument. She's presented an argument. She's given us reasons to believe that something is true. Right? And there were several arguments given throughout, particularly the second conversation, where people sort of gave reasons to justify their answers. In contrast, in the first case, no one actually gave reasons for anything that they were saying. Everyone asserted a lot of things, but they didn't give reasons to think that any of those things that were being asserted was true. Closely related to that is sort of the role that emotions were playing in the conversations. In the first case, people were sort of using the fact that they felt certain ways about the topic as evidence for the topic being the case. Whereas in the second case, it's not that people were being unemotional. People indeed felt very passionately in that second conversation, but when they were making arguments, they were keeping the emotions out of the argument. Like the emotion wasn't being used as evidence for something to be true or false. So the goal is not to be unemotional. The goal is to present reasons for things to be true or false, and to have our sort of emotional attachment and convictions not get confused as evidence, not get confused with evidence for believing that something is true. So those were a bunch of things that I noticed in the course of, when I was filling out the activity, when I was reading these things. Was there anything else that your groups noticed that you wanted to bring up that I left out? Anything worth adding? All right, great. Then let's turn to the second question. So for the second question, you were asked to look at another example where they're continuing the same conversation into this discussion into the ethical issues involved with vegetarianism, or whether or not eating meat is morally right or wrong. And for this one, I wanted you to sort of take stock of the kinds of evidence that people were presenting in the course of this investigation, and then bring up some of the issues that emerged in the course of trying to evaluate that evidence, figure out how much work it was doing, what conclusion it was supporting. And so first thing I did was I just list a couple examples of some kinds of sources, right? People were getting information from websites. They were looking at sort of governmental or expert reports, not necessarily the same as the websites, even though sometimes you'll find these on websites, right? But with a website, you frequently don't know who the person is that's actually making the argument or the claim. Whereas with a governmental or an expert source, you can always track exactly who it is that's making the claim, what their qualifications are, that sort of thing. And then also there was sort of video or sort of multimedia sources. Maybe like they didn't mention any podcasts, but maybe we could imagine something like a podcast also fitting into this kind of category as well. The central concern or the central issue that got brought up with all of these potential sources is this potential concern of bias. And this is indeed going to be a key thing we're going to talk about throughout the semester. Indeed, we'll have a whole chapter actually dedicated pretty much to this particular question. For now, let's just define a bias as some sort of like pre-existing belief that someone has about something being true that's not necessarily based upon any evidence, right? And so we'll use myself as an example here. I'm actually a vegetarian, right? So I have a bias toward vegetarianism being the right answer to this issue that they're investigating, right? That's not unique to me, though. Everyone involved in that conversation and every one of you here all have some bias in that regard, right? You all have some stance that you come into the conversation with prior to having investigating the issue about what you think the right answer is about whether or not it's right or wrong to eat meat. Right? That in and of itself isn't a problem. I mean, if everyone's got one, that can't be a problem, right? What we'll talk about this a lot as the semester goes along. The goal isn't so much to not have biases. The goal is to not let those biases impact negatively the investigation. Right? And so the concern is that if maybe someone's going to my pro-vegetarian website, is that the evidence that I'm going to give you because I'm pro-vegetarian is only evidence that supports vegetarianism, right? Or supports maybe the immorality of eating meat, and that I won't give you the other evidence that maybe is against that position. Or similarly, right, when they're talking about PETA, right, and people are raising objections to PETA as a source, the problem isn't that PETA has a strong view about whether or not it's right or wrong to eat meat. The worry is that PETA is going to distort the evidence that they present you, give you misleading evidence to try to sort of weigh the scales almost, right? Tip the balance to make you believe in a way when you shouldn't have that their conclusion is right. The same thing is true with the other website they brought up, this, PETAisevil.com or whatever, right? Same problem there, right? That's again, the same worry, at least there. There too, we have a source that very much has a strong bias. The concern is that the evidence that they're going to present will be misleading, will distort us in some way. So this concern about bias and the way that the sort of scales can get sort of illegitimately weighed in these conversations with presentation of evidence, they get even worse when we switch to sort of multimedia sources, things like videos. My guess is, let me use a concrete example of this. So my guess is that these kinds of TV shows still exist. When I was young, there were these shows that are like unexplained mysteries or whatever. I'm guessing things like it still exists, but like shows that are like, are we being visited by aliens? Is there Bigfoot or telepathy? And sort of outlandish stuff, right? Not necessarily false stuff, just outlandish stuff, right? Stuff that would be sort of surprising if it turned out to be true. And at least when I was young watching these videos, all of them were exactly the same. So there'd be some like narrator with this like really deep voice, this like really imposing voice, right? And they'd be like maybe a shot of like maybe like the camera walking through a dark forest with weird lighting, and they're like, so they were walking through the jungle and everything seemed normal. But was it? Bum, bum, bum. And then, something, right? And like, whoa, things are sketchy. What's going on here, right? Okay, but literally nothing just got said there, right? There was literally no useful information was just presented, right? But because the narrator had a cool voice and you had the nice music cue and the lighting was just so, right? The show was able to make it seem as if something suspicious was going on. Right? When again, they're not presenting any real evidence one way or the other. Right? In multimedia sources of information, it's really easy to kind of like distort things, to tip the scales in various ways by how things get shot, by the sound effects you use, by, if we go back to this particular example, maybe by having like, say, a celebrity involved. In this case, they had Pamela Anderson as the example. Pamela Anderson's more my generation. I don't know if you all even know who she is. She was an actor. The reason she's famous, or the reason she's relevant in this context anyway, she's a PETA spokesperson. Right. Now, the fact that Pamela Anderson's an actor doesn't make what she has to say about animal rights issues irrelevant, but it also doesn't mean we have any particular reason to take her seriously either. Right. Being an actor doesn't make her any kind of expert. The sort of multimedia presentation, though, can make it seem like the things that she's saying matters more for sort of like extra rational reasons, right? Similarly, we can use sort of audio-visual tricks to just basically make things more sensationalized than is actually warranted by the evidence. And so that's a serious concern that we'll need to be sort of wary of, particularly when we're using these kind of multimedia sources. They're a lot more fun, they're a lot more interesting, but the ways in which they're fun and interesting can make them more distortive, right? It's a lot harder for a boring book to like trick you with the music cue. Can't do it, right? Whereas, a movie can do it easily, or a video or a podcast can do it easily. And then there was one last issue that I noticed that got raised at the very end of the reading, actually. And this is sort of an interesting one. The reading kind of ended with Nancy stopping and almost being like, hey, what are we even talking about here? Is anything that we've discussed so far actually relevant? And I think it's actually an interesting question whether or not anything they were discussing really was relevant, at least to her central concern. She was the one who started the whole thing, and her claim was that it is wrong to kill animals for meat. If that's right, just assume she's right for a second, and that's the central question, do how animals are raised even matter? if I treat cows great, if I give them the nicest hay and if I pet them nonstop and they live their best cow lives, and then nevertheless at the end of that whole process I kill them and eat them, if that end part is right, the early part doesn't matter. If the question that's being investigated is it wrong to kill animals for meat, how animals are raised might not even be a relevant question to ask. It might not even be relevant evidence to reach a conclusion about that specific topic. On the other hand, if someone was a vegetarian for different reasons than Nancy, if someone's argument was we should be vegetarians because factory farming is cruel to animals, then all this stuff about how our animals actually raised is going to be really relevant. Right? Different question, different things are going to be relevant in the course of addressing that question. There, if we could establish that factory farming wasn't cruel, that would indeed undermine the sort of moral claim that was being raised. So the other big sort of concern we have to use when we're evaluating different kinds of evidence is figuring out just how relevant is the evidence actually for the specific question that we're going to be talking about. And that's a topic that we're going to, next week, will be really centered around that question, actually, trying to figure out what is relevant evidence for different kinds of questions, what counts as evidence with different kinds of topics. So those were the things that I saw with that second question. Again, did any of your groups come up with anything else that you thought was really interesting that I didn't mention that you want to bring up now? All right, great. If everyone's basically good, this will probably be a good place to stop for the day. Again, I don't want these sessions to run too long. I know Zoom teaching is hard. So just so I'll update you all, I believe next week we're still going to be remote from what I'm being told. I'm being told I'll be updated February 5th, which is next Friday. So as soon as I hear anything, I'll let you know what the update is. So this Thursday and then all of next week, it looks like we'll still be doing this remote thing. And then after that, it's a little bit up in the air. I'll tell you as soon as I hear anything. Make sure you turn in some version of this group activity that we've done. Make sure you get it to me by just the end of the day, by midnight or whatever. Otherwise, yeah, there's no new video and so no new quiz that you'll need to worry about for Thursday's class. Feel free to review the video if you'd like. We'll have another group activity dealing with sort of the second half of chapter 1. And the question will be focused on is what kinds of topics is it possible to actually inquire into? That'll be the main thing we do. We'll have a group activity, go through that together, and then, yeah, call that a week. So unless anyone has any last questions from me, thank you all very much. And I will see you on Thursday. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a great one.